Okay. Well, hello, and thanks for joining us today. My name is John Westra. I'm a professor in agricultural economics at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and director at the Panhandle Research Extension and Education Center in Scotts Bluff. As part of the Center for Ag Profitability's webinar series, these sessions are typically held every Thursday at noon Central Time. And you can always find an updated schedule, registration information, and an archive for all of our past webinars on our website, cap.unl.edu. During the last 50 years or so, Nebraska and other Midwestern states have experienced a dramatic conversion of intact grasslands and other non-crop vegetation, to row crop production to feed and fuel the growing world. While this has led to an increased level of production, there have also been some negative effects on ecosystems, such as soil loss, water quality issues, and the loss of wildlife habitat and biodiversity. Today's webinar will provide a history of conservation and agricultural landscapes and discuss some innovative precision conservation approaches to help farmers and ranchers in Nebraska and beyond find the balance between production agriculture and natural resource conservation. Joining me today is Dr. Andrew Little, Assistant Professor of Landscape Ecology and Habitat Management at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and Director of the Applied Wildlife Ecology and Spatial Movement Lab. Andy is a wildlife spatial ecologist focused on creating innovative solutions to the growing wildlife conservation and management needs in multifunctional landscapes, where there are competing interests for agricultural production, wildlife conservation, and ecosystem services. So to set the stage, Andy will present first, giving an overview of issues, particularly benefits from precision conservation efforts. Then I'll provide some information in my presentation on these issues from an economic perspective. And then I'll end my presentation with some examples in a framework to help landowners, and land managers better understand cost and benefits from precision conservation efforts. And then we'll open it up for questions, which you can put in the Q&A section in this Zoom meeting. So, Andy, thanks for being here and take it away.
All right. Well, thank you so much, John. I really appreciate it. And thanks again for the invite. So today we're going to again talk about this finding the balance between ag production, natural resource conservation, as John mentioned. And so we're going to go through just kind of a brief outline here. I'm going to talk about a changing Midwest landscape because I like to set the stage of kind of where we're at currently and basically where we need to go into the future. And that's going to be where we are looking at things like ag technology, conservation, precision conservation, and then human dimensions. Obviously, we work with people every day, and that's critical if we're going to be able to find the balance between ag production and natural resource conservation. All right, so we'll start, like I said, kind of setting the stage here with the changing Midwest landscape, because I really like to kind of set the stage and show where are we at currently, and how does that potentially play in where we need to go into the future and think about finding that balance. So one of the big challenges that we're faced with across the Midwest and obviously here in Nebraska is habitat loss and degradation. You see places that have now been historically were maybe farm ground are now into developments. So we're moving from that kind of that rural to urban landscape. You think about places like Lincoln and Omaha and other locations like that across the state. We also obviously have, as John mentioned, non-cropped habitat on the landscape, that may be areas that were not farmed originally that are now in production. So taking marginal acres and putting those into production to be able to maximize production. So that obviously affects wildlife populations and other things across the landscape. Landscape fragmentation is another major challenge that we face. So we obviously, looking at this image here, have challenges where we have these green patches that are noted grassland patches or intact grassland patches. But most of the landscape looks like this, which is shown in this red box. So what we see is just kind of very fragmented, little tiny parcels or patches of intact grasslands, but it's not very connected when you start looking at that and you say, okay, well, if I'm a pheasant, for example, and I need to make it from point A to point B, how do I do that in a very fragmented landscape, especially because this yellow in the background is all row crop production. This is an image from National Land Cover data set of Otoe County, a section of Otoe County, Nebraska. And so all yellow is in agricultural production. Green is intact grasslands within that agricultural landscape. And so if you're trying to get from point A to point B, it's pretty hard, especially in the winter time when there's no cover out there to help get you from point A to point B. Additionally, we've had simplification of our ag landscapes. So I'd like to point out with this image here, this graph shows it's called a Simpson Diversity Index here. And what we're seeing here is the higher the number is the higher the crop diversity on the landscape. And so you see, and this is USDA NASS data, publicly available data. You can see from back in the mid to late 1800s up through into the early 2000s, this increase in our crop diversity on the landscape. So we were upwards close to 5 different crops that were being produced in areas of the state. And then we started seeing these declines. Well, we mirror that with our corn acres in Nebraska, and we see the inverse relationship. Right around the mid 60s, we see that increase obviously in corn production. I could put soybeans up here, be very similar to that. And so obviously market forces are driving that conversion over time. I talked to a lot of people who are also hunters and landowners here in the state of Nebraska, and a lot of them point back to the 60s when they say, hey, pheasant numbers were great. Well, that was back during this peak when we had a lot of diversity on the landscape. As I mentioned at the beginning, we've obviously, with that habitat loss, have seen declining wildlife populations. Again, in part to that declining habitat across the state of Nebraska and other Midwestern states. So this is not just a Nebraska specific issue. This is really a global issue because we're seeing these challenges occur throughout the world. We also have water quality issues in Nebraska. This is an image for the nitrate concentrations. We see high nitrate concentrations in portions of Nebraska. I know natural resource districts are working on issues like this amongst many other agencies. The challenges that we're faced with, and we could have similar images up here of atrazine and other contaminants that we can have in our water systems. And that's obviously a big challenge with our water quality. Additionally, though, we have to be able to feed a growing world. And so by 2050, we're supposed to have close to, I think now it's maybe a little over 10 billion people as a projection. So we're going to have to increase food production. And so the question is, well, how are we going to do that? How are we going to do all these things? So we have these other natural resource challenges, but we got to be able to feed the world. And so I like to say, again, this idea of how do we find the balance? You know, we have to be able to find ways where we can feed the world while at the same time ensuring the sustainability of that world. And I grew up in Pennsylvania, was very involved in FFA and 4-H, and a lot of my friends actually farm still back in Pennsylvania. And one of the things that we've talked about in the past is it's obviously, you know, you own your land, you want to ensure that sustainability for the future generations. And so how can I, as a landowner or land manager, find that balance to ensure that my farm, my ranch will continue on for future generations of my children and grandchildren, et cetera. So we're going to talk briefly about ag technology and how we can strategically target conservation on the landscape using ag technology. So I wanted to briefly just highlight the importance of precision ag and what it's really focused on. It's really focused on helping you improve your efficiency, your productivity, and then ultimately your profitability by doing those two, efficiency and productivity, is really the goal of that. It also helps decrease or impacts on wildlife and the environment because we can be more strategic. So for example, if we want to take and apply, instead of maybe applying 300 pounds of nitrogen per acre, we can take and strategically target how much nitrogen is being applied to portions of the field, or pesticides or herbicides, et cetera, through variable rate technologies. So here's just an example from a cropping system side of things of all the different things. This is just a smattering of ideas of different technologies. Many people are already have these things, either are using these things within their farms or ranches. Again, GPS has really revolutionized the way we are managing our systems. Heck, it's what most people are using today, even just to get from point A to point B, using map apps to be able to get around. So we've seen a lot of advancements with our technology, and that obviously has bled into our cropping systems, and then also into our ranching systems. And I'll mention that here in 1 second. One of the projects that I'm involved in, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it right now, but I just wanted to briefly mention about it, is using precision ranching, particularly virtual fencing with precision ranching. And so specifically, what we're doing at the Goodmanson Ranch out in the Sandhills is we're actually using virtual fencing collars to take and find ways we can move cattle around from different pastures within a field. And so what we can do is these collars are put on a cow, and they have, once they cross this white line here, it actually sends an audible sound to them that, hey, you're getting close to the virtual fence line. So you can kind of picture like a white or the white fence, or the invisible fence is what I'm kind of getting at for dogs. And so once they get to that line, it gives them an audible sound and says, hey, if you're getting close to that line. And once it gets across into this line, goes in, and it will actually shock them. And so I'll show you a quick graphic of this. And so what you see is the cattle are spending time here initially. We activate the collars, and then they begin spending time in this area that we're at. And I'll play out one more time so you guys can see that. So they're hanging here. We activate the collars. You can start seeing these central locations occurring because they're getting moved back into these areas of the pasture away from that white and red area. So here's just one example of using that technology that we're able to, again, that precision ag technology. Let's see if I can, there we go. All right, so the question is now, how do you use that ag technology to be able to apply that to conservation? So I talked about this idea of precision conservation, and I'm going to show an illustration of that, again, from both the farming and then the ranching side of things. So like I said, where does it fit in? So really, precision conservation is aimed at helping farmers and ranchers find that balance, from production to soil health, to water quality, to wildlife. So one example I'm going to use, and I'm going to give a video here in a little bit about this, is prairie strips that we're working on a project here in Nebraska, across our Nebraska Research and Extension Centers, where we're basically taking and putting in, you can see these strips in this soybean field here, about 10% of a corn or soybean field in perennial vegetation strips. What Iowa State has shown from these almost 17 years worth of data collection is they've seen an almost 40% reduction in total water runoff, a 20 times increase in soil retention. So that soil is not moving down that hill; it's staying staying in those fields and not running off. And then they've also seen an increase in the avian species that are there. So if you're interested in having quail or pheasants or other songbirds in your property, it's been a great benefit to those species as well. So one of the challenges, though, when you sit there and think from a producer standpoint, and maybe some of you are, is, okay, well, if I remove that land from production, that is obviously loss of potentially profitable acres. So we have to find ways to be able to make those both pay. Because ultimately, if they're not paying, it's not going to be beneficial financially for you in the long run. And that's why we've seen such a conversion, as John was mentioning at the beginning, from over the past 50 plus years, is because we're taking those marginal acres or putting them in production to maximize the overall profitability of that land. Sorry, I'm getting over a cold here. So one of the things I always like to tell people is perspectives really do change everything. I like to put yourself in the shoes of the producer, of the landowner, when they have a $500,000 piece of equipment sitting out there that they got to pay off. And I think it's important to look from that perspective, because that's where I think innovative ideas and opportunities come from. Understanding the challenges and the barriers to adoption are critical for us as a group, a community, to be able to find the balance. It's just not, one way or another way. We got to create that synergy amongst all the different groups of individuals. So here's an example. So we can use yield monitor data, and we can actually say, okay, this field was in corn production. This is out of some data from North Dakota. And you can see, so you got kind of if you're not familiar with yield monitor data, obviously areas that are in the green to yellow are profitable or productive acres. The ones that are in red are basically least productive acres. And so when we look at this and we say, okay, well, there's obviously sections of this field here in red that obviously could be potentially modified. We could do something different with that area. And so the data that was provided to this image here showed, this is, you can see the average yield, profit, ROI from this corn here. So what that landowner did then is they took and they put that section into a pasture. And now you're actually able to now take that area that was consistently marginal and put that into something different, which then in turn increased their overall return on investment for that field. So as you continue to scale that up amongst the parcels that you own, you begin to see that larger ROI investment over time. So that's where conservation organizations and others can come into play and help you as a landowner be able to find ways to target those marginal acres that were not really productive for alternative options. As I mentioned, that alternative options, that could be a variety of different things beyond just our conservation programs too. You can have hunting opportunities there, even more strategically putting in specific pollinator mixes, cover crops, things like that that can add benefit to that parcel of land. Again, kind of diversifying that and creating ways to find that balance to help improve the soil health, to help improve address water quality issues, help to address declining wildlife populations, etc. And I mentioned before about precision ranching and using the virtual fencing. Virtual fencing can also do the same thing and provide benefits to wildlife as well. And so here's an example. You have a suite of different species here in the far left, dick thistles to upland sandpipers, and they have very different selections or needs, habitat needs. Well, now by using virtual fencing, we can actually rotate cattle around within pastures to create that heterogeneity on our pastures so that we can benefit these species as well. So again, there's benefits from not only from the cropping side of things, but also the ranching side of things as we're using this technology. So I wanted to kind of now transition quickly to this topic from on the conservation side of things. And I want to mention specifically about a project that I mentioned just briefly about, was the prairie strips. And here's an image from Iowa State just to kind of illustrate where they have this perennial vegetation strip going around. You can see there's the cornfield. Again, they're adding some level of diversity to that field. And so one of the questions that I commonly get as a wildlife biologist here in the state is, why are the game birds declining across the state? Well, it's because we have a loss of high quality habitat, increased patch fragmentation. And so here's an image from Clay Center, Nebraska in the 30s. You can see how small these fields are. Very small fields that were managed at that time. You can see that same area over time, the fields are becoming larger and larger until more present day, which is what we think about today. And so now we're talking about these areas with obviously large center pivots, maximizing production. And so this is one of the major drivers behind why we're seeing declines in game birds, is because we're moving from a very, we had a high crop diversity at one point to now we have a very monocultural based system. Obviously, market forces are driving that, and so therefore, you're going to likely see those declines, as we kind of relegate just more limited patches here and there and have that more fragmented landscape. And so we want to be able to connect our agricultural systems with conservation through diversifying them, finding ways to diversify them, help increase our overall profits, so we can make sure that landowners are able to maximize overall profitability while at the same time having benefits to natural resources on the ground. And so I wanted to kind of make that transition with this prairie strips and kind of illustrate this in a quick video as we kind of get ready to transition to John's presentation here in a minute, and kind of illustrate just an opportunity, I should say, of how we're able to strategically target conservation on the landscape to benefit the landowners. And so this project is briefly, a brief background, is funded through it's a BioEco Foundation out of California, but University of Nebraska is a sub-award with Iowa State on this project. We have a number of collaborators, as you can see here on the screen. And this project is really aiming at how do we expand this effort of prairie strips across the United States as a whole. And so my communication specialist, Iris McFarland, and a colleague of ours, Ethan Fries, put together this video that I wanted to share with everybody.
Agriculture, conservation, is art opposing ideas. Prairie strips can help reduce soil erosion, improve water quality, and provide wildlife habitat on your land. Strategically placed to maximize your ROI while creating a healthy ecosystem. Now, for the first time, you can see prairie strips at your Nebraska Research and Extension Centers.
So this gave you just a kind of a brief picture of that, and just to kind of illustrate, hey, there are opportunities, and here's an opportunity we're able to showcase at our research and extension centers now across the state of Nebraska. And so as I kind of get ready to transition to the end, one thing I wanted to make sure I highlighted briefly is the need for human dimensions work in ag landscapes and understanding the decisions, the constraints that producers are dealing with on a day-to-day basis. And so we had a project, and I'm not going to spend any time on the details of it at the moment, but just wrapped up this year, where we surveyed over 7,500 producers across the state of Nebraska and landowners, asking questions about conservation and precision ag adoption to get a better understanding of what are the barriers, what are the constraints, how can we find solutions to be able to advance and find that balance for landowners across the state around conservation and ag production. And so at the end here, where do we go? We've talked a lot about the technology. We've talked about all these, there's some potential opportunities. I think one of the biggest things that I've seen is a need for a collaborative network where we find individuals, ag producers, ag industry, university, conservation professionals working together to find those solutions. There's no cookie cutter approach for every property. Every property is different. Every field is different. But finding and engaging within local communities to find what are some of those opportunities that may exist for you. So we can create things like stackable enterprises. So we have maybe a base is the production system, but we have hunting opportunities, we have bird watching opportunities, trail riding, other sources, other ways to make additional resources on your property, targeting some of those marginal acres, again, creating different opportunities for you as a landowner. And this is where that innovation comes from, being creative and thinking about local economic development. I know the University of Nebraska has a large initiative on this, especially with in our small communities across the state of Nebraska, finding ways that we can create ecotourism opportunities. Obviously, these new precision technologies can create new jobs and opportunities there. Finding ways to, again, find that balance for landowners across the state. So I'll end with this and just say that we have a major task before us, and that is really that we have to find ways and to connect with our landowners from a conservation side and vice versa, to be able to feed the growing world while ensuring conservation of our important natural resources in Nebraska. That's what our lab does, the Awesome Lab. And so again, thank you so much for the opportunity. If you have questions at the end, I'm sure I can have some time to answer them. You can always shoot me an email if you have any other questions. So, John, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Andy. Thanks for that presentation and kind of overview and setting the stage on what options there are for precision conservation and kind of the motivation for it as well. And I'll kind of continue on with that and talk about precision conservation in just some general terms, but also talk about what are some economic aspects of that. So, looking at if you're considering something to implement on land that you manage, what does that look like in terms of the economics? So, just to get started here, so, and I'm going to try and go through this relatively quickly because Andy covered a lot of this, but, why provide environmental benefits from agricultural landscapes? Well, first and foremost, growers, landowners, land managers have been doing this probably since the dawn of creation. It's been part and parcel of the work that they've done in terms of land, managing that land for agricultural production. And as part of that, there have been environmental or ecosystem service benefits associated with that, as Andy highlighted earlier. But just to give you some ideas, and I'm sure this is just the start of a list that you may have yourselves, but you get potential increased diversity in plant wildlife habitat, beneficial insects. You've got reductions in surface water runoff and the associated reductions in nutrients and sediments from that. You get improved soil health from certain kinds of conservation practices that in turn store carbon. So you get some long-term benefits there. You also get improvements in water quality that improve in-stream habitat for fish, mussels, and aquatic insects, among others. So that's just a fairly brief list on those. I want to give a couple of examples of some work I've been involved with in the past. The prairie strips example that Andy brought up earlier, these are just some numbers associated with that. So the work that our colleagues at Iowa State had done looked at reductions in overland water flow of 40 to 45%, sediment loss of nearly 95%, reduced runoff from nitrogen and phosphorus of 85 to 90%. And so on. And these are benefits that are associated with putting in 5, 10, 15% of land strategically placed. So land in a field, for example, and converting that to prairie strips and these were some of the associated benefits from that. Similarly, a project I was involved with up in Minnesota about 20 years ago looked at some of the same things. It wasn't quite prairie strips, but we were looking at increasing the cover on the landscape and what did that look like in terms of benefits and economics as well. But we looked at a couple of different things, including putting in riparian buffers, which are similar to the kinds of prairie strips, but they're not necessarily as diverse. as well as some other best management practices or conservation practices. And again, saw similar reductions in nutrient loss. And another thing that we were able to measure was changes in effects on fisheries, habitat, and mortality in the in-stream populations for the types of fisheries that were present in this western Nebraska western Minnesota landscape. And the links to those can be found in this presentation, which will be posted on the website. So you can go read that at your leisure. Just a couple things. So, we're talking about conservation programs and conservation practices. There's a couple of ways that those are categorized primarily by USDA. And, a couple of these are ones that we're looking at with precision conservation or prairie strips. So part of it is looking at working lands, and that's part and parcel to what we're looking at here with the prairie strips, where you have some working lands, and then they're adjacent to areas where there might be a time-specific easement, or maybe it's a permanent easement. And what does that look like as options for conservation and the balance there? Just a brief listing of some of the federal programs, most of these available through USDA, where you might look to get some cost share or payments for installation of conservation practices. There's also partners at the state level that might have funding to help support or partner with some of the federal funding. And then you've also got private partners as well, nonprofits such as Ducks Unlimited, Pheasants Forever, or Nature Conservancy, among others, that partner with federal and state agencies and private landowners to implement practices on working lands. Again, just some of the places to look for that potential funding, and we'll get into that with the Q&A if folks have questions on that. But one of the things that I think Andy would agree on, and one of the things I always encourage producers to think about when we're talking about this, is these are three key questions that you need to ask yourself when thinking about conservation practices on your land. And that is, first is to look at how effective is that practice, that conservation practice, that best management practice, in performing what you're trying to do there, the environmental or natural resource benefits that you're trying to achieve. So being aware of what those options are and looking at the ones that make the most sense for you based on what you're trying to achieve on the land you're managing. Secondly, how compatible is that with your current operation? So you've got a regular farm, regular land that you're managing for ag production. You've got sets of equipment, you've got time constraints, labor availability, you have specific skill sets. How do those mesh with the conservation practices that you're considering? And that's conversation you'd have to have with your natural resource conservation professional to help you figure out what the pros and cons of any of those are and what the commitments might be. And then lastly is financial feasibility. So how does this work in your operation? I've seen a couple questions looking at that, and we'll hope to shed light on this, but that's a serious question you've got to ask yourself. And Andy had a couple of good examples there of how, when you're looking at oftentimes marginal land that may not be very productive, where, yields might be low and you're still putting in the same level of inputs into that, you may actually be losing money in certain areas of your operation. And so maybe if there's a way to strategically target those areas in your land management area and to increase your profitability overall. Okay, so I'm going to briefly go over just in general the framework that I try to work with growers to consider when they're looking at this from a financial or economic perspective. So first, you got to look at what kinds of changes are going to happen, and then is there a way to quantify what that might look like relative to your current situation? So what's your baseline or current situation? What's the next situation that you're moving into. So you're moving from maybe growing corn or soybeans on that land now. What does that look like if you put in one of these prairie strips, for example? What all changes have to happen? What does that look like? What does that mean for changes to your cost structure? And then what does it mean for changes to revenue that you're going to receive or not receive? So one thing I always try to remind growers of, and I know they're all aware of this, is not all of these situations or not all of these categories for costs and revenue are going to apply to your operation. And there are probably some that I haven't included in here. Everyone's farming or ranching operation is unique. And so that's the way that you need to approach this. So just briefly, some possible changes to cost structure to consider and try to, identify for your situation. So there's some costs that might be decreased or eliminated, which is essentially a benefit to you as a grower. You don't have to pay for those costs. There's others that might be increased. And, so maybe you're going to have to spend more time, or maybe you got to rent equipment to do this, put in this conservation practice. What are time commitments that you've got in terms of establishing this conservation practice, prairie strips, for example, any kind of equipment or machinery that you might need to rent or maybe to even purchase? Are there any facilities that might need to be constructed or built in that you don't currently have to manage this conservation practice? And then you need to think about what are your annual maintenance costs for this new system, just like you would with any kind of new production system. New crop, you got new costs that you're going to associate with that. And then lastly, and this is a really difficult thing to quantify and answer is, and because it's all unique, is what about taxes? How might they be affected by this? So now looking at the revenue side. So things to think about or consider. And again, not all of these are going to apply to your situation, but they may. And so you need to be thinking about these. So certain kinds of practices and certain kinds of production systems may negatively affect production. So first of all, you are not growing crops on that land that you put into a conservation practice, prairie strips, for example. And so you're going to have a decrease in revenue from that. Or it may be where you're looking at maybe you actually rent the land, and so you're not receiving rent from that. So one of the ways we look at that, the foregone benefits may be just the rent that you would normally achieve from that, or receive from that, excuse me. There's also decreases in revenue that might result from changes in the quality of the crops that are grown adjacent to that. Maybe there's a penalty or a reduction in the price you get at the elevator. On the other hand, that may not happen at all. And in some cases, maybe you get a price premium depending on what marketing opportunities or marketing channels you may have, where you might be able to sell this as eco-friendly or sustainable or carbon neutral, regenerative, pollinator-friendly crop. And there are growers in certain parts of the country that do achieve these and do receive these price premiums. So think about that and look at opportunities for that in your operation. And then lastly, as Andy pointed out, there's also different revenue streams that you might be achieving through this. So maybe you're getting payments through a federal program, or maybe you're getting payments for hunting leases that you have available for that area because you've got increased habitat for wildlife. And so better hunting opportunities there. So there's all kinds of revenue streams that might be there that aren't currently there, or aren't at the same level. So just a couple of things to go over, a couple of examples, and these are just some general numbers that I got from both my collaborators at Iowa State and using some information that we have from UNL's production cost estimates for specific kinds of operations for essentially establishing a system like prairie strips. Now, yours are going to vary, but this is like for establishing some kind of a conservation reserve area, which is what prairie strips might be considered. So you look at this and you've got somewhere anywhere from 130, 140 up to more than $200 per acre to establish this. So that's just getting that land into a prairie strip or a conservation reserve situation. There's cost shares for that would reduce that, maybe 50%. Those are maxed out at certain levels, so you'll have to check and see what those would be in your situation. Then you've got maintenance costs that vary considerably depending on how you manage that land. You've got some for the first couple of years. These may be higher than they may be later on. For general maintenance or operating, that's generally 2 to 3% is what the ballpark is for that, of what it costs you to establish them. And then you've got costs for mowing, raking, windrowing, baling, etc. Some people even burn these and their associated costs with that. So those are anywhere from $30 to $50, $60 per year. And again, certain federal farm programs, conservation programs have cost shares or payments to help you for the first few years of that. And then the other thing to remember is taxes. You're still going to have to pay taxes. How this affects that is something that you'd need to investigate with your accountant and or with FSA and NRCS to see what that might look like. Just some other things to think about when you're looking at conservation practices like this, in terms of, for example, what are your foregone rents from this? If you, if you're looking at it just from a course level of analysis, you've got, these are some numbers from western Nebraska, where I currently am located, from a year or so ago. And so pastures anywhere from $13 to $16 per acre if you're renting it out for cash. Dryland cropping areas, $28 to $38 per acre, and then irrigated $110 to $170. Again, obviously your situation will vary. CRP rental rates in western Nebraska for those kinds of lands are from a couple of years ago are $50 to $55 per acre. Grassland rental rates $13 to $15 per acre. So that gives you an idea what those and CRP payments may differ under different programs as well. So again, something to investigate with NRCS. Let's see, and I think I went over this briefly. I think I'm just gonna finish up with a couple things, and we'll then get into the Q&A. So looking at conservation here in Nebraska, one of the things that, Andy and I and some of our colleagues that are looking into this prairie strips and other precision conservation practices are looking at pivot corners as a way, looking at implementing certain conservation practices in that area that in many cases doesn't get much ag production, and in some cases is actually a reservoir for weeds, etc. So how about thinking about that as an area to put in prairie strips and what the benefits associated with that might be? Looking at other strips, riparian, grass waterways, etc., and how to manage those. And then looking at cover crops is another practice that a lot of growers in Nebraska implement, and looking at how do they manage that in particular when you've got areas where you've got a narrower window for establishment? You know, so again, reiterating, a lot of these practices might be worth considering on marginal land, where you may actually be losing revenue currently. So part of the conversation you're going to have with yourself, with NRCS, with others, natural resource conservationists, is looking at all the pros and cons and the benefits of doing this. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my slides, and we will see. Back here. And Andy, did you want to start answering any questions?
Yeah, I guess we could, looking here, oh, there you go. Okay, so Joe had a question, and John, I may pass a little of this to you, given your expertise in economics.
Sure.
What has been done to monetize the value of taking 10% of a field out of production, so referring to the prairie strips,
Yep.
while decreasing runoff and soil loss? It's too easy to dismiss those measures by saying you're not making money on prairie strips.
Yeah.
Additionally, how do you change the emphasis on yield for the year versus the value of long-term prairie strips measures?
Well, those are good questions. I'll take a stab at the first one, which is about how to monetize the value. I think you brought up a couple of good examples of that. So, you know, maybe if you don't have hunting going on in the areas where prairie strips might be part of that field, that would be something to definitely consider, because I think there's ample evidence that there's increased wildlife habitat, and so you're going to probably see, and this is where I'd have to defer to you, increased hunting opportunities. So, but that's a way that some growers have tried to monetize that. And so whatever they get per acre of area that they're leasing, you'll generate revenue from that you may not otherwise have done. So that's one area. I know that some, so for example, I know, and this is what I was trying to get at earlier with, you know, in terms of essentially attributes of the product that you're growing in the market, in the supply chain. So I know of a couple of examples. I know that up in Minnesota, when I was working up there, there was another project in another area where General Mills was paying growers that were participating in that to increase habitat for pollinators. And so General Mills is, you know, they make honey nut Cheerios. And so that's a way that they could promote that. They were creating habitat for pollinators. And so they paid landowners so much an acre for installing conservation measures like prairie strips that created increased pollinator habitat. Then one other thing I know, when I was down at LSU before I came up here, we were working with Kellogg's, and they were working with rice growers to look at, you know, if they were implementing certain kinds of conservation or best practices for managing rice production, then they would get a little bit of a premium for the rice, which was, you know, made into puffed rice and other rice products that Kellogg's makes. So there's a few examples that I'm aware of, and I know there are others as well. So that's one way I think that can be monetized, or several ways, excuse me.
Yeah, no, that's good, John. Kaylee had posed questions or a link to the study Andrew shared about. I will share a link to everybody for our website. You can learn more on there. We're actually in the process of publishing all that work at the moment, but we'll have more of that information out shortly.
And I will share the links to those two articles and documents that I indicated during my presentation as well.
Oh, yeah. Oh, and actually on that, John, I saw Ryan had shared those out. I put in the chat. Ryan ended up putting it in there. A couple of prairie strip FAQ sets of questions. One shows some of the things that John just talked about regarding prairie strips and the cost of implementation of those. But then also one of the other links there, Iowa State has a number of producer-specific questions because they do a lot of work with producers there in Iowa. And so they generate obviously a lot of questions from producers. And so they have a lot of different things that they have now FAQs answered. And so you can go and click on one of those links there in the chat and you can learn more. It looks like Kaylee has a question, another question here, or one more for me. Does UNL or another partner have a worksheet or other resource to help producers put pen to paper and start figuring out a cost benefit analysis?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the short answer is we don't have one yet, but we will be working on that. I think in the meanwhile, if you follow the link or links to some of the FAQs that Andy mentioned, then you can look at some of the materials that Iowa State has. And again, we are a partner with them on this. Where they've got some information to help you figure out, well, what are some of the potential costs and some of the potential benefits in terms of revenue, et cetera. So we'll get that up there. And I guess one thing I just wanted to also mention, Andy mentioned this before, but one of the things that we're currently involved with is installing these prairie strip measures across the state at our research, extension, and education centers. So we've got some at NREC and in Meade in the eastern part of the state. We've got some in North Platte at the West Central Research Center, and we are in the process of putting some here at the Panhandle this spring. And so we hope to have those as demonstrations for growers to come and see, what does this look like? You know, you put this in this spring, what does it look like 3 months later, 6 months later, 3 years later? Because Andy and I talked about this and some of our colleagues as well. You know, the pictures we've got from Iowa State, those things have been there for years.
Yeah.
They look beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, quite honestly, after the first year, they don't look too pretty. So, but we want to assure you, I mean, there are actually growers in our state that are doing this.
Yeah.
And so we want to show you what we are seeing, what they are seeing. And so we are planning to, as part of this, have field days at our facilities to demonstrate these things to growers so they can see, you know, it's going to be different in eastern Nebraska than it is in western Nebraska. We've got greatly different agroclimatic conditions, crops we grow, et cetera. So, but we've got seed mixes and practices that are tailored to these environments. So we want to show you that so you can get real information on how you can really implement this on your farm or ranch.
Yeah, no, and that's really good points, John. I guess a couple of things off of that. You know, in prairie strips, you know, they're not a silver bullet. There are none of these.
Oh yeah, yep.
Things out there are silver bullets. They don't exist. It's not, as I mentioned at the beginning in my presentation, you know, there's no cookie cutter approach that we can use everywhere. They're just a tool for landowners to use, and that's why you see, especially with the Conservation Reserve Program, numerous different programs in there, because you have different lands and different needs, different requirements. And so I would definitely encourage folks, if you have interest in conservation opportunities in your land, go meet with a FSA officer, agent, and NRCS biologist, and they can help design and help you customize things for your property. Another thing, build on that, and I think this is kind of to illustrate the importance of prairie strips, is I heard an anecdotal case of a landowner in northeast Nebraska who said, part of the reason I wanted to get prairie strips is I was losing soil on my lands, but I also, at the same time, I'm looking for opportunities to recreate kind of what I saw when I was a kid. and I was see pheasants and quail on my property, and I don't have that now. And this is just one small tool to help facilitate that. Are we going to get back to the 60s where we saw a lot of different crop diversities? Probably not likely. But that's just, again, an opportunity where we can take and strategically target these to help find those balances there, help reduce things like soil erosion, but also benefit wildlife there. And then at the same time, again, doing that in a strategic way, so you're still able to maximize overall profitability of the farmland. So I do see a comment here in the Q&A. Craig said, are you also looking at post-management and cost associated of these conservation areas? We all know labor is a big challenge of farms, and many don't have the time to properly manage conservation areas. A big issue in the conservation area in Kansas that I have noticed the lack of management, having invasive species take over like eastern red cedar, smooth brome grass, and Phragmites, among other things, which also ends up affecting upland birds like pheasants and quail. And that's a great question. And I don't know, John, if you want to speak at all to that, or.
Well, I won't talk about the actual management itself, because I think that might be more in your area, but yeah, that's what when I presented the kind of those costs for implementation, establishment, and then essentially maintenance. I mean, that's a big challenge, as you say. And so part of it is working with a natural resource conservation professional to figure out what does that look like and how does that fit into your agronomic system. Because you're right, these things are going to compete potentially, maybe not, depending on when certain activities need to be done. And so I think part of it is when you're considering this is looking at what works for you with your current system. And so if it's going to be a big time commitment that's going to prohibit you from managing that after it's been established. So 3 years down the road, you're not doing anything to manage this and it gets invaded by, eastern red cedar or whatever, that's a problem. And so you got to be thinking about that when you're trying to figure out what's going to work for you and your operation. And that's why Andy said, each one of these is unique. There's no silver bullet. You got to figure out what's going to work for you on your land.
Yeah. And I think, Craig, I think that's a great question, because I think that's a huge challenge. A lot of landowners face, and it would be great if you just could set aside things and not have to deal with them. But like you mentioned, red cedar, brome grass, etc., that they obviously creep in and then cause you other headaches. And so it's definitely a challenge. I don't have like I said, silver bullet to answer that per se. Because it definitely has an impact on our upland game birds. There's no question of that. And so it's finding things like John just said, that work for you as a landowner, and knowing that there's no perfect fit for everybody.
So Andy, I think we got time for maybe one more question if you want to tackle one.
Yeah, if there's any other questions that we have.
If not, I would just ask you to maybe if somebody is interested, and I think you mentioned this earlier, but just to reiterate, so assuming somebody's interested in learning more about any of these practices, what would be some first steps that you'd suggest they take?
Yeah, I would say that for these various conservation practices, reach out to your local natural resource professional. Again, whether that be FSA, your local biologist, in your whatever community you live in, and you can talk to them about ways to find specific things for you as you and your property. I think is one of the most significant first steps. And then they can begin to help customize things that best fit you and your own objectives, your land objectives. So.
Yeah, and I would just follow up and say that they'll also give you a much better idea of, what potential programs there might be and the cost share opportunities or payments associated with those, and maybe a more realistic or specific set of numbers for you for what it'll actually cost, you know. So depending on how diverse the species mix is, if you're going to put in plant something there for prairie strip or some other kind of conservation practice, et cetera. They've got really good information on that as well. And the partners that they work with. So
Yeah.
NRCS, FSA, Ducks Unlimited, Pheasants Forever, et cetera. They're all good people to work with. All right. Well, Andy, thank you
Yeah, thank you
for
so much.
your I've got a couple more things to say before we head out. So I want to thank everyone for being here today for this webinar. Look for the recording later this afternoon on our website, the CAP, Center for Ag Profitability's webinar website. So that's at cap.unl.edu/webinars. When you exit the Zoom, you'll be asked to fill a brief survey that will be very helpful to Andy and me so that we can better improve these kinds of presentations that we give, as well as the entire webinar series. So thanks again for your interest and participation in the webinar today. We really appreciate it.
Yep,
And
thank
have
you
a
so
great
much.
afternoon.
Appreciate it.